Good evening. Welcome to episode 84 of the Political Mike Podcast. Episode 84 of the Political Mike Podcast. The most consequential midterm election in American history just took place last Tuesday. A polarizing and divisive former president announces his third bid for the White House. Russian-made missiles cross into Poland, killing 2 Polish citizens and setting off a chain of reactions across the globe. And reports indicate that the White House has largely given up on hope that Congress will be able to raise the nation's debt ceiling during the lame duck session that runs through late December. After a week like this one, it's no wonder why an estimated 40% of Americans identified politics as a significant source of stress for them. According to a November 2020 article by the National Center for Biotechnology Information, anxiety increased from 5.12% in 2008 to 6.68% in 2018 among adult Americans. The most notable increase occurred among respondents between the ages of 18 and 25, from 7.97% to 14.66%, which was a more rapid increase than among 26 to 34-year-olds and 35 to 49-year-olds. This same study showed that anxiety did not significantly increase among those ages 50 and older, however. Anxiety increased more rapidly among those never married and those who had some kind of college education, relative to their respective counterparts. Apart from age, marital status, and education, anxiety increased consistently among socio-demographic groups. Anxiety is increasing among adults under age 50 in the United States, with a more rapid increase among young adults. In a time of global uncertainty, understanding the psychological health of the American public is crucial. And here to help me understand that psychological health of the American public are very distinguished guests in the realm of not just mental health, but spiritual leaders. We have with us again Professor Howard McDougall, who has been a member of the Howard faculty since 2000, teaching courses on property, sustainable development, and civil rights. He has a background in civil rights and community organizing and has served the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, as Washington Bureau Chief and the National Conference of Black Lawyers as UN delegate. He has served on the National Governing Board of Common Cause, the Board of Directors of the Council of the International Exchange of Scholars, Fulbright Scholars Program, and the Board of Trustees of the Paul J. Acker Foundation. Professor McDougall specializes in civic culture and civic infrastructure, focusing primarily on how these support sustainable social and economic development and human rights. Professor McDougall has written several books pursuing these themes, and he has also written numerous articles and Huffington Post blogs. Professor McDougall, thanks for being back on. We have with us Ms. Tambra Chisholm, who is a licensed certified social worker, clinical. She's now retired from Baltimore County Public Schools after 28 years of service. She has also served as a social worker in the hospital, child welfare, and home care environments. And she continues to serve since 2016 as a clinical social worker for cancer patients. Ms. Chisholm earned her Master's of Social Work degree from Hunter College in New York, and in 2016, she earned her Master's of Arts in Spiritual and Pastoral Care from Loyola University, Maryland. The idea of joining her social work degree with the pastoral care degree seemed logical to her because she has a servant's heart, and she wants to serve those in the community who are living with chronic illnesses in need of palliative care. Ms. Chisholm, thank you so much for being a part of the Political Mic today. We also are going to be joined by Ms. Tiffany Brewer, Professor Tiffany Brewer, who is an associate professor of law, teaching courses in evidence. She also teaches professional responsibility, legislation and regulation, and a seminar in Black women and the law. As a former New Jersey administrative law judge, Professor Brewer brings her judicial experience into the classroom and the law school community. She has over 20 years of teaching experience as a full-time and adjunct professor in law and public administration at universities in California, Massachusetts, and New Jersey. She's also taught courses in legal writing, administrative law, and trial advocacy, and has directed student programs focusing on externships, mock trial, and moot court. She was recently appointed by the New Jersey governor as the first African-American to chair the New Jersey State Commission of Investigation, an independent investigatory agency empowered to expose organized crime, government fraud, and corruption. Throughout her career, Judge Brewer has served in high-profile leadership roles in government, including as an administrative law judge, assistant U.S. attorney for the District of New Jersey, deputy chief counsel to the New Jersey governor, chief counsel to the Speaker of the New Jersey General Assembly, New Jersey Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, and regulatory officer at the New Jersey Civil Service Commission. Professor Brewer, it's a privilege and honor to have you on the political mic. And last but certainly not least, we have Pastor Eric Brewer, who is the founder and senior pastor of Transform Church Global Ministries, formerly known as Rhema Worship Center International. He has been in pastoral leadership for 19 years and has been licensed in ministry for 28 years. Prior to starting his own church 19 years ago, Pastor Eric served as associate minister and youth pastor at the Cathedral International in Perth Amboy, New Jersey. Throughout his ministry service, Pastor Eric has led thousands of congregants and overseen a $1 million budget. He has led Bible studies for NFL teams. He serves on the board of the Boy Scouts of America and serves as the CFO of the Esther Project. Pastor Brewer, thanks for making time to be on the political mic. I want to open up the discussion. We started off at the preface of the show talking about the toll that politics has taken in recent years on the American psyche. In the previous two episodes that we had centering on mental health, Professor McDougall, we talked about what you had identified as the vagus nerve, which of course is responsible for our fight or flight response to external stressors, such as the political climate that we find ourselves in. And the increased hostility that has been accompanying that climate in recent years. In your perspectives, how have you seen the American psyche impacted by this past election cycle that just took place? And last night, one that just kicked off with the former president announcing that he will be seeking a third bid for the White House. Anyone can jump in.
There we go. Okay, yeah, I'm muting myself. Yeah, again, thanks, Michael, for having us, and thanks to Ms. Chisholm and Professor Brewer and Pastor Eric, for coming as well. Yeah, I think there's no question that we're in a crisis, and my students give me, I'm feeling and hearing from my students the kind of anxiety that you're talking about at the beginning of the program, particularly young adults. There's climate change, climate instability, as well as political instability that make folks wonder, what it's going to be, what the world's going to be like. The vagus nerve, that we talked about, the polyvagal theory, basically, shows that we respond to social stress. We can, our fight or flight response can be triggered by a social threat. It's designed to respond if our lives are in danger, but we have begun to learn how to respond to challenges to our place in social hierarchy, for example, as life-threatening. This is what the march in Charlottesville, Virginia, you will not replace us, that business. One of the problems with the politics in the United States right now is that, particularly on the right, folks have stoked these fears, these kind of fight, flight, freeze, fears, and made people very upset. And that is kind of broadcasting a level of anxiety throughout the country that is very, very difficult to manage. I think that we have to remember that these kinds of stresses affect all of us. And the folks who we define as mentally ill or having mental health issues, are being affected by the same kinds of stresses, just in a more extreme way than we are, probably because they have experienced stress like this since they were very young. And, kind of neural pathways get etched into your brain to respond to the conditions that you live under. The more you respond, the more you experience these kinds of things, the deeper those pathways get, the more difficult it is for you to determine that something other than something really negative is going on. So I think that's the atmosphere that we're talking about. I'm going to be really interested to hear from our co-panelists who have pastoral backgrounds as to how will it be possible to soothe some of this, particularly among people who might be stigmatized as mentally ill, by congregations throughout the country.
You know, I would also echo Professor McDougall's observations of students in the classroom. And I also serve as the co-pastor with Pastor Eric of Transform Church. And, you know, we have been seeing, you know, higher amounts, I think, of concern and anxiety over the current climate, whether it be economic climate and the impact it has on homes, with our church members as well, and those that we minister to in various formats. I'm also very involved in the American Bar Association as secretary of the section of litigation. And there is a fair amount of focus now on lawyer well-being as well, because of the impact that legal professionals, you know, who are often in either judicial or advocacy roles for those who are suffering from, you know, mental health issues, even in the legal system. Now we're seeing their counsel and the judges they go before are also facing higher levels of stress, pressure, and anxiety as well. So we're seeing the same things, and we definitely look forward to talking even more about the spiritual role, the role, I should say, that spirituality actually has. Just as an example, today was my last class in legislation and regulation at Howard Law, and I, you know, asked the students if they minded if I would pray, you know, for them. I said, whatever your faith tradition is, you can just make it a contemplative moment. But it even took them by surprise when I asked them to just close your eyes and just center yourself for a moment and just get silent and just embrace peace right now, even before I prayed. But afterwards, I had so many students, and this is my first semester at Howard. So, you know, I wanted to go easy. I've worked in faith-based institutions before, so there's just an open door. But I cannot begin to tell you how many students rushed to me, even in COVID, right? And gave me hugs of embrace and said to me, "Thank you so much for praying for me. I feel so much better. And I was feeling so stressed out today." So we wholeheartedly believe that as spiritual leaders, we
Yes.
have a role wherever we are placed in the moment to bring that to these stressful times.
Yes, and I concur with your assessment. And the pandemic has exacerbated mental illness in our communities, and seeing it on the front line, being a pastor and just being able to minister to people and to talk to people in the community, in the churches, and to just encourage them in the times that we are living in. Of course, there's anxiety and stress behind the politics and the division in our nation. And on top of the pandemic, we had all of this racial unrest, as you saw the George Floyd killing on video. And so we had all this unrest in our nation on top of the pandemic, and then political unrest and divisiveness that was going on. And so I think we have to encourage people, give them hope to believe for a better future and a better community.
I would like to add to what my co-panelists have shared as a clinician, but as a school social worker, retired. And so when the pandemic hit, and I remember it was March 13th, 2020, our school doors were closed, and we thought we were going to be gone for maybe a week, a snow week, because Baltimore County loves snow days. And little did we know we were going to be a year, maybe 2 years into this thing. But what was concerning for me as a social worker for my school was food scarcity, and the fact that my families depended on my food pantry, but also depended on the services that we offered through the school system. Elementary school kids were not easily accessing the online learning. It was something new for them. So there were inequities there. Some families did not have internet service at home, and that meant that access to education was minimal, but yet they would be expected to do the work. And how can they do the work if they don't have the access? Yes, the racial unrest that existed exacerbated things for us. Our children felt that they weren't safe. Families felt that they weren't safe. And there was a need for us as a school community of service providers to make sure that our families had food, but also to make sure that our kids felt safe and that they felt that they had easy access to the educational resources that existed. What we're seeing now on the back end of it, kids are back in the building, but the gaps that exist are unconscionable, if you will. And I'm not there anymore, but I still hear how much of a struggle it is for kids academically, social, emotionally, because they didn't have access to the services, didn't have access or consistent access to the special education services if they had individualized education plans. And we're going to feel the effects of that for a long time to come.
And so I'm glad that we talked about some of the divisions that have contributed to the anxieties that we see fueling the mental health crisis that is ongoing. I just wanted to cite some numbers for you. In late April, the Southern Poverty Law Center and Tulchin Research conducted a poll this year. They conducted a poll of 1,500 Americans to examine the extent to which extremist beliefs and narratives that mobilize the hard right have been absorbed by the wider American public. And they found that the ideas underpinning the white nationalist Great Replacement narrative, recently cited by alleged white supremacist terrorists in Buffalo, New York. We saw a shooting that took place in Buffalo, New York last summer. Well, that has become thoroughly mainstream on the political right. Nearly 7 in 10 Republicans, according to this research, surveyed agreed to at least some extent that demographic changes in the United States are deliberately driven by liberal and progressive politicians attempting to gain political power by replacing more conservative white voters. And across the political spectrum, this research has found that there's substantial support for threatening or acting violently against perceived political opponents. We've seen that in the case of Paul Pelosi on October the 28th, the Speaker of the House's husband, who was attacked by a gentleman who was looking for the Speaker of the House and found her husband instead. Even in looking at how, the Americans see, this new brand of republicanism, the Make America Great Again MAGA group that has become more and more vocal in recent years. 58%, according to Reuters, 58% of respondents, including 1 in 4 Republicans, said that Trump's Make America Great Again movement is threatening America's democratic foundations. And of course, Biden gave a speech saying that this is a battle for the soul of the nation, that democracy is on the ballot. And a lot of people responded to that. We saw an increase in voter turnout. We saw that, according to 538, turnout surged during the last midterm election in 2018 when 49% of eligible voters cast a ballot. But here, there was that record was shattered in the 2022 midterm elections, with more folks coming out to vote in this year's midterm election, mostly because I should say, they felt as if they could not allow themselves to have those who are going to be willing to overturn elections get into power. So just to bring it back home to the mental health crisis, how do we, enact policies or, take substantial steps towards reducing the amount of, or the percentage of people who are coping with these kinds of anxieties when there are so many things out there fueling those anxieties to continue? The replacement theory is one. The fear of what the other side of the aisle is going to do if they take control and power is another. A lot of folks breathe a sigh of relief after this midterm election because a lot of the so-called election deniers were not successful in their bid for Congress, in their bid for the Senate. And a lot of people said, well, this is a repudiation of that brand. But yet that brand of politics seems to still be alive and well. To what extent can, in the spiritual realm and even in the mental health realm, certain solutions address these factors that are causing deeper divisions within the country?
Let me just take a quick shot at that. What you're describing, Michael, is hierarchy. Hierarchies, our lives are governed by hierarchies: race, gender, class, national origin, in some cases, even religion. And the way hierarchies work is, on the one hand, is activating that fight, flight, or freeze modality, basically saying, if you don't take orders from us, you're going to be pushed further down the ladder. You're going to be closer and closer to the ground. You're going to be closer and closer to these people who we have identified as the other, and particularly the dangerous other. But one thing I haven't talked about, and we haven't talked about, Michael, is that these kinds of social stresses also affect it's not just the vagus nerve, it also affects what are called our empathy and attachment modalities, which are located in the right and left frontal lobes of the brain. Just like I said with fight or flight, neural pathways are generated in response to experience. If we are told that we cannot empathize, we cannot attach ourselves to people who are identified as the other, it narrows the group of people that we can have exchange with. And if that group is dominated by a charismatic leader is not the word, demagogue. If that group that we are attached to, the only group that we are allowed to empathize and attach with for fear of fight or flight, on the other side, if that group is dominated by a demagogue, we're going to kind of drink in everything that person is saying. And we see these things kind of solidifying. You talk about, both sides of the aisle. On one side of the aisle, we have people who are basically saying, the only election outcome that I will respect is one in which I have won. But on the other hand, you have people on the other side, you have people who are timid, it seems, who are kind of frightened by this level of intensity that they experience on the other side and are not really ready to step up and challenge them. They find refuge in being nice, being right, things like that. And that's not really enough. But what I think is enough is broadening, trying to get back into that empathy and attachment modality and trying to broaden the scope of people that folks can connect with. And the kinds of things that Dr. Chisholm was talking about and Pastor Eric and Professor Brewer were talking about in terms of caring for people. That has to take place face to face. It can't. Social media is not going to go deeply enough for that. There has to be a lot of face to face kind of exchange, and once we get the courage back to connect face to face and empathically and attachment wise with folks that we know, then we have to start moving further and reaching out to people who we don't know. Maybe a person who we don't know, maybe he's on the other side or she's on the other side, but we've seen some signal. Maybe we're walking down the street and maybe somebody has a MAGA hat on, actually says hello to you, or you say hello to them and they say hello back. There's a book that's out now by Rosalind Wiseman and Shantara McBride. Rosalind is the author of a book called Queen Bees and Wannabes, which was the book that the movie Mean Girls was based on. And it talks a lot about how people operate inside these hierarchies, how people put each other down and treat folks as if they're less than you. And the whole purpose of that is to make you feel more powerful, to make you feel less threatened in the hierarchy. And the title of the book is Courageous Discomfort. It's like, how do you have conversations with people on the other side of the aisle? I'm not talking about in Washington. I'm talking about in your own neighborhood. How do you have conversations with those folks? One thing is you don't approach them by telling them that everything that they believe is wrong. What you want to do is you want to establish some kind of human empathic connection with them first. You want to build trust. That's really what the politics that Michael describes has been eroding in this country is trust. Our ability to trust each other, our ability to take chances and make those kinds of connections.
Thank you, Dr. McDougall. I truly appreciate that work, respect that work. I can recall in the midst of the pandemic, and we did some hard work as social workers for the school system, but we had to do some hard work for ourselves too, because disparities were quite evident. And at the time we were following the practice, and I guess they still are, I'm not there, but courageous conversations around race. And during some of our own professional learning events, it worked in small groups around having discussions about that. African American, white, Asian, Latino, Latina. And it meant that my colleagues and I had to meet each other in the screen because we weren't face to face, and have those hard discussions. What I found, because I led one of the breakout sessions, was that you had people that sat silently because they were maybe uncomfortable with the conversation, had never had the conversation before, despite the fact that we had tools, if you will, to guide the conversation. It was still uncomfortable for people. Some people didn't want others to know what their thinking was or what their practices outside of work were. But the work still needed to get done because we needed to be able to serve others. And that was some hard work, but it was done. I know that we were told to make sure that we speak from our own space. So as an African-American woman, and you start the conversation out with that way, talk about my experience and what I brought to the table as an experience. But also recognizing that I had to sit with the discomfort that maybe the other folks in the screen weren't going to add, weren't going to speak, weren't going to acknowledge, or even show compassion for what I was sharing. That's still important work. I know that the nonprofit agency that I have been working with since 2016 is about to embark upon that work. And I think it's necessary across the board. And I appreciate you saying not just at the political level, but the workplace, the community within which you live. We still have to live here, despite what the folks at Capitol Hill are doing. And we have to, if you will, get along. And it's going to take compassion. It's going to take respect. It's going to take a love for humanity, a love for those that we may not agree with, but we can agree to disagree and keep moving forward. And I truly believe that the work can get done.
So, Professor, in the article that's going to be published in 2023, I believe, in the Howard Human and Civil Rights Journal, there was a line that struck me, and it said that as your brain becomes increasingly disorganized, you will become more desperate to make sense of your circumstances, and you will become increasingly likely to hurt yourself, someone else, or property. A lack of physical safety, being homeless or in jail, will always worsen these symptoms and actually increases the depression. It goes on to say that the brain is also designed to rest by developing habits. The more frequently you visit your delusions and hallucinations, the more easily and frequently you will slip back into those thought patterns. We're in a time when, facts and reality itself, it is something that is becoming more and more subject to, relative, right? People are no longer accepting facts for what they are. They turn to alternative facts, like Kellyanne Conway, Trump's former spokeswoman and campaign manager, mentioned a few years back. For every MSNBC, you have a Fox. For every Wall Street Journal, you have the conservative alternative. You have so many different perspectives and opinions and spins on everyday events, so much so that people actually act out on things that are not true. We saw that in the case of January 6th, folks storming the Capitol over a lie. Mike Pence, of course, has been more vocal recently now that he's on a book tour. He's been doing interviews this week with ABC News and CNN. And he said, the former president put my family in danger. And you kind of pull back the veil to see what it was like to be within the vice president's inner circle on that day. And the crowd, the January 6th rioters, came within a few feet away from him, right? Only by, luck and circumstances did they not find him and other lawmakers like Nancy Pelosi and other leadership members in the House of Representatives And so we're in a time. I remember one time I was in a class with you, Professor McDougall, and one thing that echoed in my head after I left your class and graduated and went on is that you said the 2020 election will be a violent election. And I kept hearing you saying that throughout January 6th. I was hearing you say that when that gentleman took a nail gun to go to the FBI headquarters in response to the FBI raid of Mar-a-Lago. I was hearing that, when I woke up to reports of Nancy Pelosi's husband being attacked with a hammer. Are those instances of political violence and intolerance and taking drastic measures the result of what you mentioned? The brain becoming disorganized, the brain forming habits and hallucinations to fall back on to make sense of the world. And if so, how do we address those underlying symptoms to reduce the likelihood of increased political violence moving forward? What kind of public policy solutions do you think have to be in place or should be in place to kind of curb the likelihood of these kinds of instances occurring more and more frequently?
Wow, Michael, that's a really powerful question. A couple of things. I go back to the conversation that Dr. Chisholm and I were having about the need to rebuild community, in the sense not just of like we all go to church together or we all work for the same nonprofit, but more like we are all in this together, recognizing each other's humanity, having courageous, and uncomfortable but courageous conversations. So I think that part of the answer is rebuilding the atmosphere, the setting that we all operate in. And going to the quote, from the article, the more stressful the atmosphere and the setting, the more likely these neural pathways are to be created, the more likely they are to be revisited, to become deeper, and to become more and more the total reality of someone who's pushed further and further. Everybody's circumstances are different. But I think, the overall solution is, again, what Dr. Chisholm and I were talking about, which is to create a safe space to be human in this country, which is, Dr. King tried to do this, we have examples of how it can be done, but it has to be done from the bottom up. It can't be like even Dr. King, he was wonderful, but when he was killed, what was there to take his place? You've got to, the kind of leadership that he exhibited has to be echoed in every hamlet, every family, every school, in order for us to really get where we need to go. In terms of these extreme events, the nail gun and the attack and things like that, we need to turn the dial back on violence as part of our culture. There's at least, I think there's more guns in the United States now than there are people. Every developed country and developing, countries all over the world are encountering the side effects, the after effects of the pandemic, of climate instability. But we're not seeing these kinds of things happen in every country. And in most countries, people just don't have access to these kinds of weapons. So that's a real problem, and one that, again, we do need like forceful leadership, at the top, to work with this. But we can pass, Second Amendment notwithstanding, we can pass reasonable gun laws at the city level, at the county level, at the village level. We can come together and create a kind of a ripple of sensibility about how we do things at the local level. And that can kind of create a bit of a kind of an atmosphere and a safety net around us, like right where we live. And we hope that we make common cause with other communities and groups, around the country who are moving in a similar direction, we can possibly, link up and make that atmosphere more powerful. I'd be really interested to hear what the pastors have to say about this, though.
Yeah, I'm still kind of struck by what you said earlier in describing very well the concept of hierarchy, because I just don't believe we can look at, any issue that's talking about mental health and not really acknowledge the role of hierarchy and just the concept of allocation of power and what it feels like to not necessarily be at the table, or have access or perceived access to the tools to ever be there, or to feel like or have a lived experience by which the goalpost keeps moving. So we have to acknowledge the role that the structure of our society has.
Absolutely.
And the disproportionate impact it has on those that have been systematically disenfranchised and shut out legally by our legal institutions historically from full humanity as well as full participation. So as a pastor and as a spiritual leader, I think there are two things that I think are really critical here. I think that as faith leaders, we do have to provide the environment. An environment that's different. My husband is actually a doctoral student, also getting his doctorate in ministry, and I love that a part of his dissertation is looking at the impact of grief on African American men and the role of spirituality, but also encouraging pastors, kind of as one of his recommendations, to really look at ministry in a different way and to really use trauma-informed ministry techniques.
Yes.
And I know you'll talk more about that,
Yes.
honey. But that I just think that's a concept. First of all, I wrote an article about girls' courts earlier this year and how even the court system, when dealing with juveniles, particularly delinquent girls, could really benefit from some of the trauma-informed part, which really means that you are not penalizing people without looking at the root cause of their quote unquote perceived or alleged criminality, and that you're working with licensed professionals,
Yes.
clinicians, and experts to give them the help and services that they need as a part of the rehabilitation and the accountability. And so I relate that also to the spiritual realm and this concept of trauma-informed ministry, because it's our responsibility also right now as spiritual leaders, no matter what church looked like before the pandemic and
Yes.
before all of the political violence. I'm glad you used the word violence, Mike, because we have to be honest that violence is a tool that has been used in our society since the beginning of time. And as a church community and church leaders, we need to protect and even stand against the violence. And the second point I'll just make is there is the role of spirituality in helping the individual. So our church is called Transform Church, and we believe in transforming lives. So the church, spiritual leaders should be working on helping people to transform their lives. And I think that it starts with knowing your purpose. So, Mike, you talked about just the environment we live in, and there's just so much going on. Personally, I stay rooted and grounded by first knowing that I have a larger purpose than being a Democrat or a Republican. We have to minister to MAGA aficionados, as well as those that are more liberal, those that don't even believe that politics should really have a place in a person of faith's life. There are people of all ranging beliefs that we have to minister to and be prepared to help navigate, but we don't lose sight of the personal leadership and the purpose and the passion in the individual human experience that we believe can help even to get through mental health crises. To really know and understand your value. No, I'm not going to allow violence against me, even as a person of color, right? I don't allow microaggressions. I don't allow stuff, because that's violence. And because I know my self-worth, I know my purpose, it
Mhm.
helps to strengthen me in times of adversity. And so those are some of the things that Pastor Eric and I
Right.
really, even in sermons, in teaching, and we use our faith to really go that deep.
I appreciate great comments. And one thing, and thank you again, Mike, for the invitation. I believe in therapy.
Yes.
And I always believe in my counseling session, instead of asking what's wrong with you, I ask the question, what has happened to you? What has happened to our community? What has happened to this nation? And there's so many triggers that's going on. So we saw the death, the murder of George Floyd on video. And we know this has been happening for years as unarmed African-American men has been killed by police officers, killed by in neighborhoods and so forth, citizens and so forth. And so we have all of these triggers that's taking place that's re-traumatizing our community. And Professor McDougall and I was talking about intergenerational trauma, transgenerational trauma. And I know, Sister Chisholm, you see it in counseling, families and patterns that's going from one generation to the next generation. And in my study, I found that trauma will change your DNA, can change your DNA. It's called epigenetics. And so when one generation experienced trauma, and then they pass it down to the children and to the next children. So you may have a battered woman, and then the child sees that it grew up in a home where there's so much violence, and that child inherits and anxiety and high blood pressure. And so what we see in our communities is transgenerational trauma. And how do we respond to this transgenerational trauma and these triggers that's taking place when you see the riot, Charlottesville in Virginia? You see Ku Klux Klan, when you hear this racial overtones or whistles being blown, when you see police officers, the blue line, and several towns they had a blue stripe right down the main street. And so these things can re-traumatize, the triggers that re-traumatize our community, and we have to address it. Now, one thing about African Americans, we have learned how to have trauma responses. We are great in survival, and we have a history of survival. We just came back from Dakar, Senegal, and on Gorée Island is the door of no return. And what we learned is that our people were prepped for the Middle Passage. Those who survived the abuse, they earned the door of no return. And then they went to the Middle Passage. So we come from generations, a legacy of survivors. We have learned to survive under the most oppressive, systematic oppression, hostile environments. But however, surviving has had a major impact on our health. We're not resting. We're not, the pandemic hurt our community. So many of us died at a crazy percentage compared to other ethnicities in our nation. And so all these things play out in our communities. There's a statistic that says 2/3 of adults have experienced some form of trauma. And 1 out of 5 children before the age of 18 have experienced at least 3 major traumatic events in their lives. So you start looking at people and in our congregations, in our communities, and say 90% of our community have experienced trauma. And what are we going to do? There are people in our churches sitting in our pews, and we have to be able to minister to them. And I know as a pastor, things that's outside of my job description. I'm not a licensed therapist, but we have to teach. We have to partner in our communities with licensed therapists and do things that are on the cutting edge. I remember in our community having a mental health weekend, and I brought all the churches together, and we had all these clinicians, and we had free counseling all Friday, Saturday, and even on Sunday. People can set up appointments. And the number of people who were suffering from depression, who was wrestling with suicide, children, we had therapists for children, all ages. And it was a great event, but it broke my heart, the number of children and people that were wrestling with suicide. And so this is what we're dealing with.
I'm glad you mentioned that, pastors. I think that one of the first steps is acknowledging that the adverse childhood experiences that you reference do exist, because they do. And even we as adults who have had what's called ACEs sometimes have not healed from that. And so some of our trauma responses, if you will, come as a result of that root of the adverse childhood experiences. When you talk about the church house, I know that there are some churches. I know there's one here in Baltimore, and there's a church in Philly I used to attend that have what's considered or called a pastoral care and pastoral counseling ministry, where there are licensed clinicians that are part of that ministry, some that have gone through university programs where it's specifically dedicated to pastoral counseling and pastoral care. I myself have the pastoral care degree because I'm already a clinician, so I didn't need to go back and get the pastoral counseling piece. But I think it's important that churches begin to look at that. So I'm glad to hear that you're offering those opportunities, but to actually have something in-house where congregants or people even from the outside can come in and access those resources, because we have to heal. And I think doing it with the clinical and the spiritual aspect married together addresses the whole person. And I think that that's important. And acknowledging is the first step. Amen.
The whole person, I think that's key.
The whole person.
Can I just ask Dr. Chisholm to just talk a little bit more about, I mean, how is pastoral counseling differ from kind of straight clinical psychiatric or psychotherapeutic practice? What does the intersection of spirituality and clinical knowledge, what does that look like? How is it different? I think the audience would really like to know the answer to that question.
So I'm not a pastoral counselor. I have my pastoral care degree, but I do know that friends of mine, colleagues of mine, former classmates that pursued that degree are practicing through faith-based protocol initiative, if you will, but marrying the two. So if you are a pastoral care counselor, you are meeting someone where they are spiritually, but bringing with it the tenets of clinical counseling so that that person can heal. I think that what's important is that whomever the provider is recognize that they have to start where their quote unquote patient, if you will, is first. And if it's about where's God in all of this, then that's the conversation that a pastoral counselor is going to have, versus a clinician who can't have that conversation with fidelity, with the proper training, with the proper preparation to have that discussion with someone who wants to speak from a faith-based aspect. And I'll just use myself as an example. I'm a clinician, and in the schoolhouse, I also served on the traumatic loss team for my school community. And there were times where we had staff maybe or students who wanted to speak from that space, but because I'm in a school setting, they say I can't, okay? But I didn't shy away from that. If someone brought it up, then I was going to address it with them. Whereas in a church, through ministry or through a nonprofit organization that is specifically offering pastoral care, pastoral counseling, then you can have those conversations. Most of those people that have that degree are LCPCs and not so much social workers or psychologists, if you will. I hope that.
One thing I'm sorry. I can't let this go. I mean, one of the things that we've been talking about is how comfort, these neural pathways that I've been talking about. It's like a salve that's laid over it. The comfort of being with folks who recognize your humanity of engaging in activities, cooking or whatever, just community, kinds of things, laying this kind of salve, over these neural pathways that are trauma informed, trauma, as Pastor Eric was saying, coming from trauma, and ACEs, what you're talking about. That's and I'm thinking that, to me, one of the most powerful things about the church is not just the minister who stands up in the front, but the Holy Spirit that energizes the whole congregation. And I'm wondering if there's a way for a pastoral counselor to tap into that in terms of helping people who are having these kinds of difficulties feel enveloped, with that energy.
Yes, and that's one of the things about our church, Transformed Church, from Romans 12:2, be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind. And so we believe that the Holy Spirit helps your mind to be renewed. Giving your life to the Lord, for us, changes your heart, your salvation, your state, your eternal destination. However, your mind still has to be renewed, and it's renewed by the Holy Spirit, of course, the Word of God. And we believe that if you transform your mind, you transform your life. And if you can transform your life, then you can transform the world. But it first begins with you being transformed in your thinking, in your thought process.
And also in terms of what Professor Brewer was saying about finding your purpose. I mean, I was really struck by a quote from President Biden, who's not like the most, kind of energetic and powerful speaker, but he was apparently in the Rose Garden with a group of families who had lost loved ones to gun violence. And he said that his family hadn't lost anybody to gun violence, but they did lose a son. And he said that they found that the way to respond to grief is to find purpose. I mean, that really struck me, because I think a lot of us, particularly those of us who are in progressive, spaces and trying to make things better for people, there may be traumas of our own that we're responding to by finding purpose, by trying to find a way to make it better for everybody, so that the kinds of traumas that we've experienced or that our loved one has experienced don't have to keep happening again and again.
And what President Biden actually didn't go even deeper and talk about is way back when he first became a United States Senator and the loss that he suffered with his daughter and his first wife traumatically, and how, others could have said, I'm going to step down from public life. But he turned his pain into purpose as well. And, some may look at his journey as just, kind of white privilege, charmed life in the Senate. But he is here as president, I believe, for such a time as this. And think of the refreshing that many of us feel that this country had in the midst of a pandemic, with him even winning the election. But if he had not persevered through circumstances that most people would have withdrawn from public life and maybe even felt sorry for themselves, and we would agree with them. You should feel sorry for yourself for all this trauma that happened, right? But he turned his pain into purpose. And I think that's what spirituality continues. And as faith leaders, that's what faith is really about too. Dr. King said it's taking that step, I'm paraphrasing, on the staircase, even when you don't see the stair. So ultimately, yes, Professor McDougall, I do think that as faith leaders, we believe that invoking, the presence of God, which is that representation of the Holy Spirit, is the presence of God, and that unknown thing that's happening. That's your hope. That's your future. I can't touch it. I can't see it. But I just know that this is not all when I'm in adverse situations. This is not all that I am meant for. I am here for greater purpose This
Yes.
pain I'm going through, it's not the end of the story. We're going to keep turning the page. This is a chapter.
Absolutely.
It may even be a volume, but it is not the end of my story.
Yes.
And in the end, I believe that that's what, those of us that are in the faith community have to, on a very personal level. I think gone are the times, we talk about this all the time, of kind of the mega church and thousands of people there. No, it is time for faith leaders to know their congregants' names and pain personally, and build up a team of people, because you don't want to wear yourself out either as a first responder, which we are. But we need to raise up a generation of people that are compassionate, that include trained clinicians who can teach us something about how to do this, and partner together to really start rescuing people from the mental health crises to reveal their purpose.
I'm a living testimony of this.
Yes.
For those who don't know, I am a COVID survivor and a COVID widower. My church was in Hackensack, New Jersey, which was ground zero for COVID in New Jersey. It spread it from my city. And I eventually contracted it, and along with my late wife, and she passed. And so I had to leave my community, leave my family, through grief, the church, of course. And through all of the pain and all the suffering and all the grief recovery, I have went back to school, working on my doctorate, writing a dissertation on the resiliency of African American men and how their spirituality impact their grief recovery. And I have a widower support ministry that is on its second phase, and we're ministering to men, African American men from around the nation who have lost their wives, not just from COVID, from all types of sicknesses and diseases, and especially during this holiday season. And it's so, what you said, Professor Harold, in reference to purpose, and what Professor Tiffany just shared as well, is in your pain, finding your purpose. God will use your pain as a platform to help other folks. God wastes nothing. And so what has been a blessing to so many men, it came from a place of pain. And even through my pain, I learned to love again, to live again, to laugh again, to learn again. But I had to go through this grief recovery, not only for myself, but to be able to turn around and help someone else.
I got to say, Pastor Eric and all of you, and of course, we haven't given Michael a chance to talk at all.
Yeah.
But I want to ask Michael, what you just heard the pastors say and Dr. Chisholm say about transforming adversity and pain and stress and anxiety into purpose. What do you think the possibilities are of your generation, kind of taking the trauma that they are experiencing right now and maybe turning it into a purpose that's going to make all of us kind of look back and say, wow, I'm really glad I knew these young people when they were coming up?
I think about, and I'm glad you asked that question, Professor, because I honestly think that this past election was evidence of transforming pain into purpose, like we've been talking about. We saw a record number of folks in their generation, Gen Z and millennials, coming out to vote, transforming their anger, right, about the climate crisis, about the threat to democracy, about gun violence. We've seen instances of mass shootings in schools this year, tragedies coming out of those kinds of situations. And all of those things motivated so many young people to turn out and vote. And the historian Doris Kearns Goodwin came on Morning Joe this morning, and she was expressing how, every once in a while in American history, we have a specific generation that decides to take upon itself the task of ensuring that tomorrow looks better. She mentioned Franklin Roosevelt in the Great Depression, inspiring folks to look beyond the current economic situation of the state, and actually ended up becoming what is now known as the greatest generation, as they started to give up more of themselves to volunteer more than ever before in record numbers. Even those who were not involved in the war effort had some kind of role back at home in the United States. Then John F. Kennedy, who inspired folks to, give of themselves to keep, the spirit of sacrifice and service alive in the United States. Barack Obama, inspiring folks to want to be the change they want to see in the world, as he says. And so I think a lot of people took that to heart this last Tuesday, and we saw it in the results. If I think millennials, Gen Z folks did not turn out, it would have been a much different election. And so it kind of pivots me to some of the work I've seen some organizations do, organizations that are tasked with trying to come up with solutions to addressing mental health issues. And there was this one organization in particular that I'm thinking of that actually saw voting as almost like therapeutic to, or civic engagement rather, as therapeutic to, some of the anxieties that folks are dealing with, some of the feeling of not having a place in the world, of not having a purpose, of not fulfilling, a specific set of goals. And so I want to ask you, panelists, do you believe that there's some kind of merit to that belief that voting, civic engagement can serve as a productive and constructive way of addressing some of the mental health issues that we've been discussing today, as opposed to the, retreating to violence, as opposed to allowing our brains to create hallucinations that we're comfortable with, that we mentioned earlier in the article excerpt?
Well, it's certainly a way to feel like you're part of something. And that connects back up to the whole discussion about finding your purpose. Some of the students in my classes were saying that they weren't sure that they wanted to vote because they didn't know if their vote would count. And I kind of relayed back to them some of the kind of analysis that you just described, that it isn't just, well, first of all, if your vote wasn't important, why are people trying so hard to keep you from voting, right? That's number one. But the second thing is that I advise them to vote together, to get all their friends, do a social media drop and just say, hey, let's all go down to the polls. Maybe there's early voting. Let's all go together. Let's do this together. I mean, like families, when their children reach the age of voting age, they'll all go as a family, and vote together. It isn't just about the impact that you're going to have on this huge, multi-million vote, kind of outcome. It's also that you feel that you're worth this, that this is your right. You step up and you do it.
I think the act of voting is an act of self-advocacy, giving your voice, lending your voice to those things that matter, that are important to you. And I also think that it's about building the community within which you live. I think that is important, and it's a part of the voting process. Without it, you have no voice. And I think exercising that right to vote is a powerful tool, and self-advocacy is one of those tenets.
I wholeheartedly agree. And just personally speaking, I think that, well, first, I have a master's in public administration, bachelor's in political science. When I was a little girl, I would literally do mock political elections, as a one woman mocking each person candidate in the elections, by myself. So I feel like I learned now that has been a part of who I am, my gifts, the platform that I'm interested in, connected to my purpose. But that aside, as an African American woman in the United States, I believe that it is a part of my human responsibility to vote in every election that is ever in the history of the world eligible for me to vote in, because history has shown us, by the violence that was perpetuated and the lives that were given and the blood that was shed, the bruising and the bruised ego, right? And the humiliation tied to it shows us that there is power. Why would systems in this country be created that would even brutalize people to prevent them to vote if voting was not powerful? So voting is our American responsibility to preserve this democracy. But as a descendant of former slaves in this country, I think that I just have no choice but to continue to honor the legacy of Fannie Lou Hamer, of, you know, those that were civil rights workers who were killed and never seen again. So I could go on. Don't get me started, Mike. I could preach.
Amen to that. Amen to that. Yes.
Yes. And I just want to concur with that. Just thinking about the history of America and systematic oppression and Jim Crow laws. However, racism has a way of causing the victim to have internalized devaluation. And voting says, as Sister Chisholm said, I matter. Self-advocacy, I matter. I'm going to vote because I'm a human being and I have the right to vote. And when you think about it, the fighting off the negative thoughts, internalized devaluation says, oh, my vote doesn't matter. Why not? You should vote because your vote does matter.
Yeah.
Can I add to that? What calls to memory for me, when I first moved here to Maryland, because I'm from Brooklyn, New York, I had my daughter with me in my first act of voting here in the state of Maryland. And she was standing with me. I wanted her to see what I was doing. You start them young, you show them how it's done. And there's a white woman who said, no, she can't be in there. And I said, why not? I'm her mother and she's not going to touch anything. She's watching what I'm doing. I'm modeling responsible action, social action for her. That was my conversation to that woman. She walked away because she didn't have an argument for what I was doing. And I think not only is our responsibility to vote, but it's our responsibility to teach
Absolutely
the generation that's coming behind us that this is what you do. This is your responsibility. How dare we not?
Yeah. You know, it's interesting as you describe that, the reaction of that woman, seeing you, like the nerve of you. You know, I mean, not only you here, but you're going to bring your child in here as well. Because one of the things we have to remember about hierarchy is that hierarchy is a means of controlling the in-group as well as the out-group.
Yes.
Racism is a way of controlling white people as well as black people. You know, white people can say, you know, in the middle rungs and the lower rungs, well, I'm better than these black people, but they have to follow the orders of those above them. And that causes a kind of an instability, you know, that's, you know, very, very serious. And, you know, the idea that you would have the nerve to walk in there and vote as if you were a real human being, as if you were a real person. That isn't just you stepping out of your place. That's you threatening my place. You know, because I'm supposed to be way better than you. I mean, and you're not even supposed to even think that you can do the kinds of things that I can do. So there's the power of voting. Even if you went into the voting booth and you didn't even cast a ballot, you just walked in and closed the that would be enough to send ripples throughout that whole establishment.
And I'm glad each of you mentioned, you know, your take on this, because the Jed Foundation found that young people in particular feel that political involvement rarely has tangible results. That's 36%. And politics today, according to 56%, are no longer able to meet the challenges our country is facing. And of course, this can inspire feelings of fear, of anxiety, of depression, of hopelessness, in addition to election stress. But this same study also found that voting, civic engagement, like we've been addressing, actually is a strong way to combat any of these mental health illnesses. And so I'm glad that you each brought that up. In the closing moments of the program, I do want to open up the floor for any last thoughts. Are there any last thoughts before we conclude?
I would just say that folks should understand that, you know, while you are one of millions voting in national elections, you're one of maybe thousands voting in state and local elections. And you know, there are local elections that are decided by a few votes. So pay attention to your community, pay attention to the politics that surrounds you immediately. And, you know, you might be surprised at the results that you're able to generate.
I'm glad you brought that up, Professor. There was a report that surprised me recently. I think that New Hampshire's state legislature was called for the Republicans, but by one vote, through a recall, one vote changed everything, and now the Democrats are controlling that state legislature. So if you don't believe your vote matters, that's evidence enough. I think there was also a 14 vote difference in another election. I mean, we see instance after instance how tight some of these, this election was a real squeaker when you look at it. The narration around this election is that the election deniers lost, and that the MAGA candidates were defeated because Americans were tired of the extremism. But when you look at the margins by which these folks lost, is not, is really by a coin flip that lost. It was very thin, these margins, state by state. Professor Brewer, you're going to say something.
I was just going to say, I think civic engagement is important as a motivation for voting as well.
Yes.
When you know and understand the system, then you understand your role that you have to play and the role that voting does really make in it. And you also learn that, you debunk the myth that voting is the only way. Of course, it's easy to feel like your vote doesn't matter if you think kind of in your mind that voting is the only way that a citizen has to participate in the process or to be at the table. It is one of many. In my legislation and regulation class, my real goal is to get the students to understand the Constitution, how it divides power, and where they, as citizens and as future lawyers representing clients or being advocates, can impact the system at every single point in every branch of government. How many of us have ever gone to a public hearing that has to legally occur before your rates for your cable or your water or your public utilities are raised? How many people go? I used to oversee those hearings. 1 to 2 people would show up, if that. Right? And how many of us know to monitor regulations that may, and give a comment on them that may impact us as citizens? So there are so many ways, if you are engaged civically and know and understand your government and the process, that you won't feel so powerless, and you'll know the role even that voting has as well. And I do think that is lost, Mike, in the generations that are coming up now. So I think there's a direct correlation between the lack of civic education and the anxiety around feeling like my voice does not matter. And so that's something that we can do no matter what generation we're in. And I'm glad you were encouraging Professor McDougall, your students, to grab friends to come and vote with you. But we I think just have to start the movement back of get involved also means be knowledgeable, learn the system. Don't just try to blow it up and you don't know what the system, how it works. The current system could allow you to impact it with your gifts and talents, but you have to know it.
And I would add, from the mental health perspective, that mental health is important. Own it. Take care of yourself. Self-care, self-advocacy is not selfish. Right. It is critical to your well-being, and it is critical to your voice as you're voting. So be aware of policy, be aware of the needs in the community, be aware of your own needs, but more importantly, recognize that you have to stay at the table, keep your voice in the conversation. If you need to go to your pastor, if you need to go to your clinician, do it. Don't shy away from it. Not to do so causes you not to have the voice that you need so that you can speak on behalf of yourself, your family, and others in your community.
Thank you so much, Professor McDougall, Pastor Eric, Professor Brewer, Ms. Chisholm. It's been a privilege and honor to have such a rich discussion on such an important topic. Professor McDougall, if you could remind the viewers where they can access the article that will be published, Neurodiversity and the Mental Health Dilemma, where they can find it, when it will be available.
Yeah, it should be available early next year, the Human and Civil Rights Law Review at Howard University. In the interim, a draft of it is available at the Social Sciences Research Network on my author page, Harold McDougall, you can kind of see some of this stuff. And I also want to thank Sister Chisholm and Pastors Eric and Pastor Brewer. What a powerful conversation. I mean, Pastor Eric talking about his experiences and how that the trauma informed ministry, and I'm just in awe of all of you.
Thank you so much. With that being said,
Likewise.
with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and conclude episode 84 of the Political Mic podcast. Thank you all for tuning in. And as I always do, I want to encourage you to refrain from sketchy sources of news and challenge the sources of news that you do plug into. It's critical. It's important. It's the vital part of just being a citizen. Thank you so much for each of you and what you brought to the table tonight. This will conclude episode 84 of the Political Mic podcast. Thank you so much.